All right, so we're here with Fraendy Clervaud, and Fraendy, you just came back from the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington up in our nation's capital. What a monumental day.
Yes.
And you were there in the heat of it all. I mean, you were with Claflin University students, had an opportunity to travel up there. Overall, what was the trip like for you?
I would have to say the one word that sums it all up for me was just historic. And I know that sounds cliche for many people, but on two fronts for me it was important as a journalist and then also as an African American to see how the civil rights movement, to see when folks were marching for racial equality, to see what it was like for these other individuals who were there talking about how years ago before it was difficult for them to even walk there, dealing with all the different attacks they had to go through to be there. It was just so historic.
And you mentioned, as a journalist, as an African American, but as an African American man,
Yes.
I'm sure it had an even deeper impact, being on the heels and walking in the same path that another African American man walked to make such a huge speech.
Absolutely. Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, his speech, I Have a Dream, resonated with us that weekend. And not just that weekend, but every day. Yeah. For me, what stands out the most as an African American male is the fact that because of them marching 50 years ago, because of his I Have a Dream speech, the door was open to have a journalist like myself that's on the air, and I'm anchoring a newscast. I'm corresponding special reports, and you're not seeing my face as a mugshot, or it's not because I'm in jail, or it's not because I did something bad. Because of course, when we report the news, more times than other, plenty of the mugshots are always African American males. It's always like that. But to know that they walked so I could have the opportunity to be educated. I, had opportunity to go to the University of Florida, a 4-year college institution, whereas before we knew it was so difficult for individuals to do that. And so for me, it was very important, for me to cover this and for me to be there as well because of all the doors that were open for me because of these individuals like Dr. King and others who marched on Washington.
What are some of the points, or if you could pick out maybe 3 highlights for you on the trip, what would those be?
3 highlights would be the students at Claflin, just to hear how they felt about everything, to hear stories about their grandparents, their great-grandparents who experienced a lot. One student that I interviewed, her ancestors had to go through the Great Migration where they had to leave Mississippi and Alabama and move up to Indiana because of the racism and because of the heartaches that was on that family. Hearing from another student whose grandfather was involved in a sit-in in Maryland in the 1960s. So, not too long ago.
Not that long ago, yeah.
He and a handful of others sat there at a restaurant, and that was their protest. We're not going anywhere. We're staying right here. To hear that. Also another student who's from California, and him moving to the South.
Wow.
And we know California was not as racially divisive as the South, but him coming to the South and still experiencing it,
to culture shock,
exactly, to hear from his perspective that other things that stood out to me, especially when I was in front of the march, when I saw Dr. Martin Luther King III, when I saw Cory Booker, when I saw Al Sharpton, and Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, Trayvon Martin's parents. And just to look at that for a moment,
Spectrum.
Janet.
It's a huge spectrum of history there up until this very day.
Exactly.
Wow.
For me to take all that in, I just, with my camera, I was like, wow. Because, we look at Jesse Jackson and we look at Reverend Al Sharpton, and critics will say that, sometimes they incite certain things. People may not like their approach, but you look at them as being right now the current civil rights pioneers. And so to see Sabrina Fulton, to see Tracy Martin and others, their name is escaping me right now, to see like, wow, this is going to be the new face of civil rights.
Of civil rights and race relations.
Absolutely.
In our nation. Now, I know that, of course, the main thing on everyone's mind is racial equality and race relations, but people were marching for other things as well. Talk about that.
One of the things that stood out was immigration rights. Because we know right now the issue with immigration, trying to get people their path to citizenship, folks who have been here illegally, folks who came to the United States when they were kids, no fault of their own, having to deal with a family who comes to America and their son or daughter is 2-3 years old, and now you're saying that they have to leave the country.
Right.
So those individuals were there wanting to speak out on behalf of those who were involved in immigration. You also had women's rights. People talking about the equality for women, about being paid. Exactly, equal pay. That was a really big issue. You also had folks talking about protecting the voting rights, because just recently the Supreme Court voted down a measure that said that the states don't have to go through the federal government to change voting rights laws in their specific state.
Right.
So that for many people was a slap in the face, because we're thinking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right, and here we are years later, and it's still a topic.
Issue.
It's still an issue, very much so.
So those three things, coupled with racial inequality, stood out the most for me.
Well, what would you say to someone, I guess, as we are embarking on this 50th anniversary and you being there, moving forward, like what this means to you and how we can move forward from this type of moment?
I would say moving forward is remembering where you came from, remembering that a lot of the freedoms and a lot of the rights that are at our disposal came with a lot of fighting. And many people feel that there's no need to march anymore, there's no need to have rallies. But seeing the march on Saturday and seeing how passionate, and we're talking about young people, the high majority college students, which in a few years they're graduating, they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. They're going to be the next principals, the next superintendents, they're going to be the next politicians, and even the next president, congressmen, politicians on Capitol Hill making laws for ourselves. And I would have to say, remember where we came from and to continue that legacy.
And the things that change and shape and mold us and that have brought us this far as a nation, in fact.
You're right about that.
Fraendy Clervaud, so good to sit down and talk about this trip. What a milestone and a mark in history here, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington.